Welcome to a special episode of Wings of the Raven. I'm your host, J.R. Bloodsteel. Tonight, I'm bringing you 3 true horror stories that took place on the spookiest night of the year. I hope you have your bowl of candy ready and your emotional support blanket standing by. Our first story tonight was sent in by Rachel, who wanted to remind everyone that while it's fun to be scared, it's better to be safe. It's kind of funny how we so easily forget the fun things we did as children and somehow manage to remember the things that scared us to our core. This was back in the late 80s. I was 12, right on the cusp of thinking I was too old to be trick-or-treating, yet still young enough that I didn't want to give up on the free candy just yet. Every year had been the same, really. My neighborhood would always get a load of kids, and both my mom and dad would take me out to collect the yearly goods. It was always a family affair, and even my mom would dress up with me. Halloween was, and surprisingly still is, one of my most favorite holidays. This year in particular, everything was the same, except there was a new family down the block. We hadn't met them yet, but our neighbor had and said they seemed like nice people. Husband, wife, and 2 teenage sons. They had been living there for around 2 months by this point and appeared to be quiet people. As my family and I were walking down the street, my parents ran into one of their friends from work. Not wanting to stand around and wait for them to finish talking, I asked if I could go ahead and continue going to a few houses. I was a responsible kid, and my parents knew this, so they let me go. I had never been scared of strangers or put off by scary decorations. I went to a few more houses, making sure to only stop at the ones that had their porch light on. When I reached the 7th house, I realized it was the one with the new family. For a second, I thought that my parents might want me to wait in case they wanted to say hi to them, but I figured if that was the case, we could just circle back. The house was plain on the outside. It was gray with no plants. Rather drab, if you ask me. It had no character, no personality. All the other houses on the block had some sort of landscaping, but not these people. I could have sworn there were plants here before, but I never did pay that much attention. The porch light was on, though, and that was all that mattered to me. Approaching the front door, I knocked. A few seconds later, the door opened to reveal a middle-aged woman. She was smiling, but her appearance came off as worn out and exhausted. She, herself, could have been a decoration with how tired her eyes were. I told her, "Trick or treat," and she complimented me on my costume, gave me my candy, told me to enjoy myself, and then that was it. Simple, normal interaction. I turned and walked away after thanking her. As I was going down the driveway, I noticed someone standing right by the garage. He was holding a chainsaw and had a mask on. This is Halloween. That didn't faze me. I didn't stop until I heard the saw turn on. I had seen the prop once before at the local Halloween store, and this sounded nothing like it. I had heard my dad using a real saw before, and I recognized the sound of metal against metal. Stopping in my tracks, I looked back at him. Even with his mask on, I could see his eyes. They were wide and piercing right through me. This is the night when you're supposed to make people scared, but the fear that crept across me was a different kind. It lacked the fun spark that came along with Halloween fear. My parents were still down the block, and something told me that if I took off running right now, this guy was going to chase me. I turned around and started to calmly continue my walk down the driveway when I heard him say, in this creepy, weird voice, "Don't you want to stay for the show?" I took off running down the sidewalk. The way his voice sounded was right out of a horror movie, and I had had enough. He didn't chase after me, but I did hear the chainsaw kick into full gear as I ran back to my parents. When I reached them, they were surprised to see me out of sorts and startled. I didn't tell them what had happened, just that there was a guy who caught me off guard. Simple explanation. Later that night, it was after midnight now, we had long since returned home and I was still up, going through my candy with my mom. We would always check each piece, just to be on the safe side. As we were standing in the kitchen, she noticed flashing red and blue lights going down the road, heading south. The neighborhood had always been a calm, safe, and quiet place, making this extremely weird. She and I went out front onto the porch, just to see where they had stopped. Towards the end of the block, we saw them stop at the house with the new family. I felt my skin get colder than the chilly night had already made it. Right then, I told my mom what had happened and how the guy had a real chainsaw. She wasn't incredibly alarmed, but she did find it strange as well. We went back inside and kept to ourselves. It was the next morning we learned what had happened and why the police had been called. Apparently, the teenage boys had some issues, some mental health issues, and the parents never really did anything about it. The reason why the plants were gone was because the older son went out with his chainsaw one evening and cut everything down to spite his mother after they had an apparent argument. The reason why she looked the way she did on Halloween night was because she had been trying to stop her sons from acting out, and when she pushed them too far, the younger son held her in the house, threatening her with a knife he had pulled from the kitchen. He was right behind the front door every time she'd open it, and he was there when she gave me my candy. The husband was away on a work trip at the time, so there was no one else in the home to defend her. The reason why the cops were called was that she finally was able to slip away from her sons and call them from a neighbor's house. Thankfully, no one got hurt, and they did move out a few weeks later. I don't know whatever happened to the sons, but I never did see them after that night. I am thankful that when the older son saw me, the thought of hacking up a kid in a princess costume didn't cross his mind. After that Halloween, I hung up my trick-or-treating bag and started handing out candy instead. Everything else was quiet for the rest of the time we lived there. Our second story tonight was sent in by Claire, who wanted to remind everyone that if you think someone is following you, then they probably are following you. Some people take this holiday a little too far when it comes to acting like the characters they dress up as, but it never bothered me before. Last year, though, while I was out with my sister and her kids walking around their neighborhood, I came face to face with someone who took staying in character too seriously. In the years following the separation between my sister and her now ex-husband, I've gone walking with her on Halloween night while the kids are trick-or-treating. They're still young enough to not understand what happened between their parents, and my sister, who I'll call Alice, never felt comfortable walking the streets without someone who was older than 6. We left her house around 7 in the evening, right as it was getting dark. Her neighborhood is a nicer and more expensive one, and there were tons of houses to stop at. We walked up and down multiple blocks, letting the kids milk the holiday. It was carefree fun. There were a lot of families out walking the streets as well. Loads of parents were dressed up right along with their children, which wasn't something that was unusual to see. What was unusual, though, was the one guy I spotted walking along the sidewalk about halfway through the night. He was dressed as Michael Myers, which alone isn't alarming, but he was walking by himself. This was absolutely a fully grown man, there was no question about it. Solid frame and at least 6 feet tall. I saw him, wondered where he was walking to, and then proceeded to forget about him once we all passed him on the side of the road. As the night was winding down and there were less people on the streets, I saw him again. At least, I thought it was him. But at that time, I tried telling myself that there could have been more than one person dressed in that particular costume. My gut knew I was lying to myself, as his stance and frame were the exact same. He was standing near the street corner we were approaching, still keeping his distance from across the street. As we walked by, I glanced back behind us, and while he hadn't moved, I caught his head turning, like his eyes were following us. Quickly looking back at Alice, I told her I thought we were being watched. This creeped her out, but she blew it off as someone just trying to scare people. I tried to agree with her, but it didn't feel right. We're 2 women, both in our early 30s, and we're alone out here with the kids. I felt like an easy target. By the time it took to get back to Alice's house, I saw him one other time, standing across the street from us as we walked by once again. I couldn't figure out how he got from one spot to the next without me seeing him, and how the hell did he know where we were going? Now I'm getting concerned. I tell Alice again, and this time she looks over and spots him too. She still brushed it off, but this time I didn't. My mind wouldn't let me. We got the kids back to her house in one piece. The rest of the night had been calm, and after spotting the Myers wannabe last time, I didn't see him again. He didn't follow us back to Alice's either. I hung around for a bit before leaving. It was getting closer to 9 and I had work in the morning. When I got home, I went inside and got ready for bed. Walking for over an hour wore me out, and I had already had dinner with Alice and the kids. I took a shower, read for a while, and got ready for bed. It was a quiet night and everything was completely calm outside. I fell asleep pretty fast, only to be woken up within what felt like seconds later. Glancing over at my clock, I found I had been asleep for almost an hour. That feeling alone was strange, but mixing the confusion of how I got woken up made it worse. My room was dark and quiet. There were no strange sounds, and I know my phone didn't wake me up because I had lowered the ring volume before going to bed. I laid still, looking over at the far wall, still dazed. A second later, though, a bolt of energy pierced through me as I heard the slight sound of what I thought were fingernails scraping across the screen of the window directly above my bed. As if I wasn't frozen enough, I held my breath for a second as the sound, even though it wasn't loud, seemed to fill the room. There were no animals that could do this, not around here. I knew instantly it was a person, which clouded my mind. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to make any noise or turn on any of the lights. I got out of my bed as quietly as I could and tiptoed out of the room after grabbing my cell phone. I've been a stickler for always making sure my doors and windows are locked and that my curtains are always closed at night. This barrier between me and whoever was outside was the only thing giving me the least bit of comfort. I crept into the kitchen and stopped at the window above my sink. It was pitch black in the house, so I took the chance and moved the curtain back to see if I could see anything out there. The window overlooked the backyard. I couldn't see anything. I don't know if that's because it was too dark or if it was just simply because there wasn't anything there. Dropping the curtain, I slowly moved through my house. It's been silent ever since I left the bedroom, and I was starting to wonder if it had all been in my mind. I had been working a lot lately, and my sleep schedule was already messed up. Maybe I imagined it all. I wasn't about to go outside and see for myself if there was someone out there, so I went back to bed, but I laid down in the guest room this time. The entire rest of the night was silent, and I actually was able to go back to sleep after an hour or so had passed. When the morning came, I got ready for work like normal. It wasn't until I was about to walk out the front door when the weight of last night hit me over the head fully. Lying on my welcome mat was a Michael Myers mask. I screamed at first because it caught me completely off guard, and the sudden sight of it startled me. I jolted back inside, shut and locked the door, and called the police. The realization that someone had really been outside that night punched me. And while I didn't actually see anyone, after seeing that mask, I knew it had been the guy who was following us around the neighborhood. I don't know how he managed to follow me home or what he wanted, but there wasn't anyone else it could have been. I knew the police probably weren't going to be able to find anything, but I didn't want to bend down and pick up the mask on the off chance that's why it had been placed there. When an officer arrived, my suspicions were confirmed. There was no one on my property. He just left the mask behind. I think this year, Alice and I will be taking the kids to the mall for trick-or-treating. Our third and last story tonight was sent in by Samantha, who wanted to remind everyone to take their personal calls outside. This took place 8 years ago, when me and my boyfriend were both 25. We had been dating close to 4 years by this point, and were really serious about our relationship. Everyone around us knew this, even the people I worked with. I had a cubicle job at a local travel agency. It wasn't glamorous, and the office spaces were cramped, leaving no room for personal conversations if you got a phone call. I knew most of my coworkers, though, and never worried about being overheard. It was Halloween of 2015, and a friend of mine, Susan, was throwing a big Halloween party at her place. Both Grayson, my boyfriend, and I were invited. For every year Susan would throw this party, we would go. We knew everyone who would be there, and they knew us. It had become tradition at this point. The movie Scream 4 had come out in 2011, and since then, Grayson would always revert back to dressing up like Ghostface, the murderer from the movies. I was tired of seeing it, but he wasn't one for going crazy with his costume, so I never said anything about it. He never wanted to buy a new one. He had gotten a reputation by this point, dressing up as Ghostface, so I let it be. The day of the party, I went over to Susan's before the party started to give her a hand with setting everything up. I had planned on meeting Grayson later that night once the party actually started. The day went by quickly, and I spent most of my time just helping her. By the time 7 had rolled around, some of the guests started showing up. It wasn't long before there was a house full of people. I hadn't heard from Grayson yet, and when he didn't show up right at 7, I stopped for a second and wondered why he hadn't shown up yet. Right as I stopped to scan the living room full of dancing partygoers, I spotted his iconic ghost face mask through the crowd. Before I could get his attention, he started walking towards me and took my hand before leading me towards the kitchen. Susan's house was full, and there were people quickly spilling onto the back porch. There were strobe lights, blaring music, and both Susan and I had already started pre-gaming before everyone showed up, so I was already buzzed. Everything was fine. Everything seemed completely normal. Grayson and I danced, hung out with our closest friends, and by the middle of the night I was far more intoxicated than I planned on getting. I've always been a bit of a lightweight, and when I wouldn't pay attention to how much I've drank, Grayson normally would. He's normally the first person to stop me when he notices me staggering, but for some reason, he hadn't. Even in my drunken state, it suddenly dawned on me that he hadn't really done or said anything. Even when talking with our friends, he would just nod his head in reaction. He never spoke a word. I asked him why he wasn't saying anything, and in response, he rubbed the area under his mask, like he was trying to signal he had a sore throat or something. Again, I'm intoxicated, so my judgment was almost non-existent by this point. I remember squinting my eyes at him, questioning his gesture. Before I could ask another question, he took my hand and started leading me away from the horde of people and up the stairs to the second floor. I thought maybe if he does have a sore throat and doesn't want to yell over the music, he's taking me someplace quiet. I followed him without question, letting him guide me into one of the bedrooms. To the best of my knowledge, he hadn't drank. Hell, I hadn't even seen him take his mask off once. But the way he started acting made me think he was also intoxicated. The minute we were in the bedroom, he closed the door behind us and gingerly pushed me against the wall. Now, Grayson and I were flirtatious and playful with one another, but nothing like this had ever happened before. At least, not at someone else's house. I started giggling as his gloved hands landed on my outer thighs and moved slowly up my legs, slipping underneath my dress. I was dressed as Daphne from Scooby-Doo, so my dress didn't leave much to the imagination. His hands came around and grasped my rear, and at the same time, Grayson leaned down like he was going to whisper something in my ear. The next several minutes, I can't remember them. The last thing I remember was hearing this deep, raspy voice whisper very clearly, "You feel even nicer than I could have ever imagined." It was not Grayson's voice, and I instantly realized that the man I had spent the entire evening with was not my boyfriend. Susan would later tell me that my scream was heard over the loud music, making everything and everyone stop. She also told me that I came running down the stairs, bawling, screaming, all while a few other guys who were there at the party went upstairs and were able to capture and contain the man I had been with. The police were called, and the next memory I have clearly is sitting outside Susan's house with Grayson, wrapped up into his arms, trying to fight off a looming panic attack. Grayson told me that while he was at his apartment getting ready, someone came knocking at his front door. When he opened it, he remembered seeing a man standing there, but he didn't get a good look because the man knocked Grayson out cold. When he finally came to, his costume and phone were gone. Both Grayson and I learned that the man he opened his door to was a guy who I worked in the same office with. I'll call him Peter. His cubicle was directly behind mine. I barely ever spoke with him besides the occasional small talk in the break room. I never knew he was a psychopath, or that he had been stalking both Grayson and I for the past several months. He had our home addresses, phone numbers, and close contacts saved in his phone. Peter was arrested, and I left my job the very next day. I would also like to mention that Grayson and I are now married and are expecting our first child. I'm thankful he was all right, and that Halloween of 2015 didn't end differently for the both of us. Everything could have been so much worse. Do you have a true horror story you would like to share? Email me at wingsoftheraven.podcast@gmail.com and it might be featured on the podcast. Thanks for listening. Happy Halloween and sweet nightmares to you. Stay safe.